So before Ros and I had kids a long time ago, someone gave us a holiday to New Zealand. They knew that we couldn't afford overseas holiday, and so someone gave us a 17-day motorhome tour of New Zealand. We flew into the North Island, picked up a motorhome, drove down through the North Island, and then across into the South Island and flew out of there. If you've ever done that, you know that to get from the North Island of New Zealand to the South Island of New Zealand with a motorhome requires you to be on a ferry. And it's a big ferry. Looks kind of something like this. Grainy picture of the ferry. It's real. They call it a ferry, but like it's a big ship, right? And the island, the waters between the North Island and the South Island can get really rough. They can get really, really rough. Sorry for those of you who are going to be doing this trip. And Ros can get really seasick. Really, really seasick. And so a friend who'd done the trip said, look, I'll give you the tip. I'll give you the hot tip for surviving the ferry ride between the North Island and the South Island. And they said, here's the tip. When you get on the boat, go straight to the ticket office and buy a ticket for the little cinema that they have on board. There's a little cinema. It's a tiny little room, more like a kind of an oversized home movie, a little cinema on board. But they said there's a weird thing that happens in your brain when you're inside in the dark in a cinema, which is your brain will be so focused on what's happening in the movie in front of you that you won't notice the movement of the boat and you won't get seasick if you're in the cinema. And we were a little sceptical, but we thought we didn't have much to lose. Ros and I had both witnessed how bad seasickness can be for Ros. So we did it. Got in the boat, went straight to the ticket office. And it's about a 3-hour ferry ride. Takes you about a half an hour to get out of the sheltered waters of the North Island, and there's about a half an hour at the end when you're in the sheltered waters of the South Island. So that 2-hour movie was exactly what we needed to cover the rough seas in the middle. And you know what? It absolutely worked. Worked like a treat. Ros, for the very first time in her life, was on a boat in rough seas and had no seasickness at all, and we got to see chicken run. It was win-win, right? Life can be a bit like that ferry ride, I think, for lots of us, which is when the storms come and things get rocky, if you put yourself in a place where you're focused on the right thing, those storms can just seem to all of a sudden fade into the background. We're in episode 2 of a series that we're calling Rest. We live in a world that has got so much going on for all of us. Everyone is so busy, we said last week. And many of us feel like life just doesn't stop. That life is just coming at us all the time. And many of us crave rest. In this series, we're asking ourselves, how can our faith help? In this desperate need we have for rest, what does God have to say about rest? What can we learn today from the life of Jesus and the life of the early church about rest? Can our faith help us find the rest that so many of us feel like we desperately need? Last week we looked at what God has to say about rest. We discovered that God's idea of rest isn't about chilling in front of Netflix. It's not about lazy days on the beach. It's not about weekends and holidays. That God has a far better plan for the rest that we so desperately need. That the rest that God talks about for people is a kind of resting in Him. It's a kind of deep peace. It's a kind of inner contentment. It's that sort of deep breath that we can take that just says, I'm safe. I'm home. Everything's going to be all right. If you missed last week, I really encourage you to catch up on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts. All of our messages are on there. But you know, sometimes life doesn't go our way. Sometimes stressful, challenging, exhausting things come our way. And so in the episode this week, we're going to ask ourselves, how do we find rest in the storms of life? How do we find rest when things aren't going our way, when storms come, when everything gets rocky and wavy around us? And the good news is that we don't have to look very far. We don't have to look very hard to find an answer to that question. Because the Bible story is full of stories of people who are facing difficult times. It's full of stories of the lives of people whose lives just don't go to plan, whose lives aren't following the sort of script that they hoped they would follow. It's full of people stuck in the middle of a storm. And we're going to go to one of the most famous of those stories this morning. It's a story that happens right in the middle of the life of Jesus. One of those stories that happens at the end of a day. Jesus has spent the day teaching and sharing with people about who God is. It's sort of a busy day. I'll let Mark tell us what happens at the end of the day. This is Mark chapter 4, verse 35. If you've got a Bible with you, there's always Bibles at the back of the room. If you've got one on your device, go there now. Mark chapter 4, verse 35. That day when evening came, so we're talking at the end of the day. That day when evening came, Jesus said to his disciples, "Let's go over to the other side." Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was in the boat. There were also other boats with them. A furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was asleep in the stern. The stern is the back of a boat, for those who don't kind of know, what a boat looks like. Jesus was asleep in the stern. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" He got up and he rebuked the wind. He told it off. He rebuked the wind and he said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." Then the wind died down and it was completely calm. And he said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" They were terrified and they asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him." First thing you should notice about this story is that the whole thing was Jesus' idea. Verse 35, he said to the disciples, "Let's go over to the other side." Mark, who wrote this, wants you to know that this trip was Jesus' idea. And that's a really important detail because it tells us that sometimes Jesus will deliberately take us into a storm. Because we live in a world, we often think, don't we, that a storm means that Jesus isn't there. That a storm means that Jesus has somehow abandoned us to the world out there. Sometimes we think that a storm is a kind of punishment. This is coming, a storm comes our way because we've done something wrong or something else and we're being punished by the circumstances. But Mark wants to show us in this story that Jesus is right in the middle of the storm with us. In fact, sometimes Jesus might even take us into a storm on purpose. Not as a punishment, but to teach us because he loves us. Second thing you should notice is that Jesus is asleep in the middle of the storm. Which sounds crazy, but that's the way the story goes. Verse 37, a furious squall came up and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. In the middle of the storm, Jesus was asleep. In the middle of the storm, Mark gives us a picture of what's the ultimate picture of rest? It's someone sleeping on a cushion. This isn't an accident. This isn't a coincidence. This isn't because Jesus is crazy tired. Mark wants you to know that Jesus knows rest and peace in the middle of a storm. Mark wants you to know that when you're in a storm, Jesus is the person to look to find rest and peace in the middle of those circumstances. And the last thing I want you to notice is Jesus' response to the disciples. Verse 40, he said to them, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" It's like Jesus is surprised. He's not surprised that there was a storm. He's not surprised that storms are scary. He's surprised that they seem to have forgotten that he's in the boat with them in the middle of the storm. He's surprised that in the middle of the storm, they are unable to find peace in the fact that Jesus is there. It's a powerful, powerful question that Jesus asks them. Why are you so afraid? I'm here. Why are you so afraid? And it's a question that I believe Jesus is still asking each of us today. If you're a follower of Jesus, if you have Jesus in your life, if you have Jesus in the boat of your life, why are you so afraid of a storm that might come? When Jesus calms the storm, he's demonstrating that he is God. Now, it's really easy for us to miss this detail because we don't see storms and things the same way that people did in Jesus' time. See, in Jesus' time and in Jesus' culture, there were all sorts of people who could teach clever ideas about life. I guess that's a bit like today. In Jesus' time, there were all sorts of people who claimed that they could heal our bodies and fix relationships and things like that. I guess that's just like today. In Jesus' time, there were all sorts of people who believed and who talked about having some kind of special connection with God, which is, I guess, just like today. But to control the weather, only God can control the weather. No one ever claimed to be able to control the weather in an instant with a word. That's why in verse 41, when the disciples said, they were terrified and they asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey them." That's Bible talk for them saying, okay, who is this guy? Who is this guy in the boat with us? Because only God can control the weather. Mark's telling us this story to tell us that you can trust Jesus in whatever storm, in whatever circumstance you find yourself in, because Jesus is God who created all things and is in control of all things. It's such an important thing for us to understand. He's making it very clear that in Mark's mind, Jesus isn't a helpful old nursery rhyme. Jesus isn't a nice guy with some wise ideas for living. Jesus isn't a great example of how to treat others. I mean, he might be those things, but Jesus is the God who created and controls everything. That's the point that Mark wants to make in this story. The sun rises when he says so. The wind blows where he tells it to. The stars shine because he gave them light. Why are you so afraid? Jesus deliberately takes his friends out into the lake. Jesus deliberately takes his friends out into the storm, and then he goes to sleep. And when they wake him in the middle of the storm, he calms the storm with just a word. Then he turns to his friends and he says, "Don't you know who I am? Don't you realise who's in the boat with you? Haven't you worked it out yet? Is your faith still your faith still just this small? Have you not got it yet? Don't you know that I am the God who created the universe and I am here with you in the storm? Why are you so afraid?" Storms will come in life. Following Jesus is never promised us as an easy path. It's not a way to have sunny days and perfect weather through life. That's never been the point of faith in Jesus. Jesus allows the storms to come, and in some cases like this one, sometimes Jesus deliberately brings the storms. And most of the time I don't know why those storms come, and if you're like me, most of the time you spend yourself, kind of scratching your head going, I don't know why this storm has come my way. That's not the point of Mark's story here. What he's trying to say is, don't be surprised. Don't be surprised when the storms do come. Don't be surprised when life gets hard. Don't be surprised by pain and failure and disappointment. And don't forget who's in the storm with you. Jesus is the God of the universe squeezed into a human body. And if Jesus is in the boat of your life with you, why are you so afraid? If you follow Jesus, Mark wants you to know that you can find rest in the storm. You can find a cushion and go to sleep trusting that God is in control. Not because the storm has instantly stopped, but because Jesus is there with you in the storm. It's a really important distinction to make, isn't it? The way Mark tells this story, the way he arranges the story, it's really clear that the point of his story isn't actually that Jesus calms the storm. Jesus does calm the storm in the end, but that's not why you shouldn't be afraid. The point of the story is that Jesus is in the storm with them in the first place. Does that make sense? That's why you shouldn't be afraid. Jesus isn't promising to spare you from the storms. He's promising to be in the storms with you. Jesus is inviting you to find rest in him in the storm. Jesus doesn't calm the storm and then say to them, you've got no reason to be afraid now, you can find rest. Jesus examples rest in the storm. Peace in the storms comes from focusing on Jesus in the storms, not on waiting for Jesus to get us out of the storm to then find peace. It's a total world of difference, isn't it? In fact, as Mark shows us in the story, sometimes it's in the middle of the storm where we meet Jesus best. Jesus deliberately took them into a storm to teach them something that would change their lives forever, to show them who he was, and to show them, to give them the skills to survive the next storm and the storm after that and the storms that he knew would come their way in the years to come. Why are you so afraid? So as we think about rest today, there are two questions I think that this story asks each of us. The first is, who's in your boat with you? As you navigate the storms of life, I mean the real storms, not the what's happening on a Sunday morning kind of storms, but as you go back into your work and into your family and into the other stresses of life, who's in the boat with you? Because we've got people in our boats, don't we? We've got family and we've got friends and we've got ideas and we've got, magic products that people tell us if we buy this thing, we'll be happy and life will be cruisy. We've got a whole bunch of stuff crammed into our boats. Who's in the boat with you? That's the first question. And the second question, which kind of hinges on your answer to the first question, is why are you so afraid? Following Jesus is no guarantee of an easy life. Mark makes that perfectly clear, that storms will come. But his point is that you don't have to sail out into the storms alone. Who's in the boat with you as you sail out into the storms of life? The God who created the weather, the God who controls everything, can even control the weather, is inviting himself, if you'll have him, into the boat with you. And if you'll say yes to him, you don't need to be afraid. He's promising that you can experience rest and peace and contentment in the storm. Sometimes the storm will stop. Sometimes the storm will go on and on. That's not the point. The point is that with Jesus we can find rest in the storm. We can find peace and contentment and hope and joy and wonder and love in the storm, because that's where Jesus is with us. He's in the storm. Why are you so afraid? And I guess the flip side of this invitation is to say that if you're not yet a follower of Jesus, if you're a person who's sitting here today, and you don't have to raise your hand or anything, but you kind of know that Jesus isn't quite in the boat with you. Maybe you've been hanging around church for a bit or hanging around faith for a bit, but you know in your heart that there's kind of a line you haven't crossed, you know? This story is an invitation from Jesus, saying, I would love to be in the boat of life with you. I would love to help you navigate the storms. I would love to help you find peace in the storm, but you've got to invite me in. Jesus isn't the kind of God that will, in most cases, push himself in. He will wait for an invitation. He will wait for you to say, I want you in my life. And so for some of us, it's the invitation that is important today. It's the decision to say, yes, I want you in the boat of my life.